State's bankruptcy court in Manhattan. A company that once employed 304,000 hourly workers on American soil, that put a car in every driveway from Detroit to Dallas, that controlled 54 cents of every dollar spent on a new vehicle in this country, sat at a table and filed for the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. $172 billion in liabilities, 2,400 dealerships erased overnight, a government writing a $49.5 billion check just to keep the lights on. But here is the thing that nobody tells you. General Motors did not die because of Japanese competition. It did not die because of oil prices or the financial crisis or bad luck. It died because of decisions made inside polished boardrooms by men who stopped caring about cars decades before the collapse. This is the story of how the most powerful company in the history of American manufacturing chose comfort over survival and paid everything for it. In 1955, General Motors did something no private company had done before or has done since. It sold more than 4 million vehicles in a single year and captured 54% of the entire American car market. Not a plurality, not a lead, more than half. Every other manufacturer, Ford and Chrysler included, was fighting over the scraps. At its peak, GM was not simply a car company. It was an economy inside an economy. The big three collectively controlled 94% of all American car sales. By 1960, 1 in every 6 working Americans drew their income directly or indirectly from the auto industry. GM alone ran 5 distinct brands: Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, and Cadillac, each positioned to pull the customer up the ladder as their earnings grew. It was a genius designed to trap a consumer for life. The federal government was so alarmed by the concentration that it considered forcing a breakup under antitrust law. GM was that powerful. Detroit was the center of the industrial world, and General Motors was Detroit. The company ran so fat and so flush that it once paid out special dividends on top of its regular dividends simply because the profit had nowhere else to go. This was not just a corporation. It was the physical expression of the American post-war promise that hard work, scale, and industrial muscle could build an empire that nothing could touch. The men running it believed that completely. That belief was the first seed of everything that followed. The trouble started not with a crash, but with a promotion. For most of GM's early history, the people at the top had come up through engineering and design. They understood the product. They had opinions about how a car should feel, how it should perform, what a driver deserved. Then, gradually and without announcement, the axis of power shifted. By the 1950s, the finance division in New York had become the true nerve center of the company. Roger Smith, who rose through accounting before becoming chairman in 1981, embodied this shift completely. He was a numbers man. Under his watch, GM spent $90 billion on factory automation, while the actual cars grew blander and increasingly difficult to tell apart. Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick began sharing the same platforms, the same engines, and eventually the same bodies with different badges. Customers noticed, dealers noticed, the boardroom did not. The finance staff's word became the final word on almost every decision. Design requests that would affect margins were rejected. Manufacturing improvements that carried upfront cost were shelved. The question was never, will drivers love this car, but what does this do to the quarterly number? GM's average annual operating margin fell from 8.7% in the 1960s to 1.3% in the 1990s. When you stop building great cars and start managing spreadsheets, that is what the spreadsheet eventually shows you. If you have seen this kind of institutional rot up close, and I have, you know it is invisible until it becomes catastrophic. Subscribe and hit the bell. The stories we cover here, you will not find on the evening news. October the 1973. Arab members of OPEC cut the oil supply to the United States in retaliation for American support of Israel. Within months, the price of a barrel of oil quadrupled from $3 to $12. Drivers queued around entire city blocks to buy rationed gasoline. Green flags at the pump meant fuel was available that day. Red flags meant go home. GM's entire product line was built on the opposite of fuel efficiency: the V8, the full-size sedan, the long hood and heavy frame. American consumers, terrified of empty tanks, did the obvious thing. They walked past the Chevrolet dealership and into the imports lot. Honda Civic sales more than quadrupled between 1973 and 1976. Toyota cemented a reputation for reliability that Detroit could not match, in a price bracket that Detroit could not afford to compete in. GM had a choice at this moment. It could read the signal, retool its thinking, and build cars that matched the new reality. Instead, it reached for the old playbook. It built some smaller cars, they were largely terrible, and it waited for gasoline prices to settle so the big vehicles could come back. When they did come back temporarily in the early 1980s, GM took that as vindication. It was not vindication. It was a delay of the reckoning. The Japanese did not leave. They used the oil crisis window to build American factories, train American workers, and earn American loyalty. GM had handed them the door, and they walked through it, and never left. Here is what Toyota understood that GM refused to acknowledge. Waste is not just a cost problem, it is a product problem. The Toyota production system, built on eliminating every unnecessary step, every redundant movement, every defective part before it reaches the next stage, produced cars that simply worked better. Fewer recalls, fewer breakdowns, higher resale values, word spread. By 2007, Toyota's American market share had climbed to 16.3%, more than double what it had been in 1990. In that same window, GM fell from 35% to 23.8%. In early 2008, for the first time in American automotive history, US consumers bought more foreign-made vehicles than domestic ones. The milestone passed almost without comment inside GM's headquarters. Toyota was not competing on price, it was competing on trust. Every Camry that lasted 200,000 miles was a quiet advertisement against every Oldsmobile that had started rattling at 80,000. GM's quality problems were not accidental. They were downstream consequences of the decision to treat every cost reduction as a victory and every engineering complaint as an inconvenience. The executives in Detroit knew the numbers. They received the reports. They watched the charts move in the wrong direction for 15 consecutive years. And what did they do? They blamed the unions. They blamed the government. They blamed the consumers for being disloyal. The one thing they would not blame was themselves. That question, how a company can watch itself lose in slow motion and refuse to act, is the most important question in this entire story. There is a quote from Rick Wagner in 2003 that tells you everything. Speaking at the Tokyo Auto Show, he was asked about competition for market share. He said, "I am not in charge of Big 3 market share. I am in charge of Big 1 market share, and our goal is to grow." The big one in 2003. When Toyota was already accelerating past them, the culture at GM had calcified around the belief that size was a permanent advantage. The company had been so dominant for so long that the idea of genuine vulnerability felt theoretical. Executives received detailed internal reports on quality gaps, on pension exposure, on the mounting cost of healthcare for retirees, on the share losses. They did not suppress the information. They read it, discussed it, and continued as before. One former CEO described the internal culture as managing the message rather than the problem. Divisions that raised uncomfortable projections found their funding reviewed. The annual bonus structure rewarded short-term volume numbers rather than long-term product quality. Managers learned quickly what the company actually valued. The gap between GM and Toyota in labour cost was running at roughly $25 per hour per vehicle by the mid-2000s. GM acknowledged this. The plan to close the gap was always just over the horizon, always dependent on the next union agreement, always 3 years away. Meanwhile, Toyota was opening plants in Kentucky and Indiana, paying competitive wages, operating without the legacy burden, and taking customers that GM had owned for generations. Now here is the part of this story that almost nobody tells. For years before the bankruptcy, General Motors was not primarily a car company. It was a financial services company that happened to manufacture vehicles. GMAC, the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, was created in 1919 to help consumers finance vehicle purchases. By 2003, GMAC was generating $2.8 billion in annual profit for GM's bottom line. That same year, GM's actual North American automotive operations were described by the company itself as marginal. In the second quarter of 2004, GMAC's earnings of $860 million dwarfed worldwide automotive earnings of $529 million. The cars were losing money. The financing arm was keeping the lights on. This created a structural illusion. The consolidated earnings looked acceptable because the bank was performing. Nobody in the boardroom had an urgent reason to fix the underlying automotive problem, because the overall numbers were passable. The incentive to confront the rot directly was constantly diluted by the credit business's cushion. Then GMAC made a fatal expansion. It moved aggressively into mortgage lending during the housing boom. By 2006, GM needed capital urgently and sold 51% of GMAC to a private equity consortium for roughly $14 billion. The housing market collapsed. GMAC's mortgage portfolio imploded. The cushion was gone, and what was left underneath it was a car company that had been quietly hemorrhaging for a decade with no one willing to say it clearly. In 1950, General Motors began agreeing to something that seemed reasonable at the time and catastrophic in hindsight. Medical insurance, pension guarantees, and eventually the 30 and out provision, which granted workers full pensions after 30 years of service regardless of age. A worker could join the line at 18, retire at 48, and collect pension and healthcare benefits for the next 3 decades. The union celebrated it. The company signed it. Neither side modelled what happens when you have far more retirees than active workers. By the time GM filed for bankruptcy, the company was supporting 10 retirees for every single active employee. Healthcare obligations alone were estimated at $60 billion at the end of 2007, with only $16 billion set aside to cover them. Legacy costs ran at roughly $7 billion per year through the 1990s and into the 2000s. By 2007, GM had spent $103 billion on these obligations over the previous 15 years. Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai carried none of this. They built their American operations decades later, without the accumulated weight of promises made in a different era. Every car GM sold carried those obligations in its price. Every car Toyota sold did not. That $25 per hour labour cost gap between GM and its competitors was almost entirely composed of costs for people no longer building cars. The numbers were visible to everyone inside the company. Changing them required confronting the union, the retirees, and the political cost of breaking promises made in better times. Nobody wanted that fight, so the bill kept growing, quietly, year by year, until the total became impossible to ignore. September 2008. Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy. The global credit market seized. Banks stopped lending to each other, let alone to consumers buying cars. GM's sales had already been sliding, but the credit freeze turned a slow decline into a free fall. Americans who might have financed a new vehicle could no longer get the loan. Dealerships that depended on floor plan financing to carry inventory suddenly had their credit lines frozen. GM was burning through roughly $2 billion in cash per month by the autumn of 2008. In November of that year, the company disclosed it had less than $11 billion in liquidity remaining, against monthly cash burn rates that gave it approximately 4 months before the doors closed. The financial engineering that had obscured the automotive problem for years was suddenly, completely exposed. There was nothing left to hide behind. GM had already shed 140,000 employees before the formal bankruptcy filing. It had already closed factories across the Midwest, cancelled brands, and restructured union agreements. None of it was fast enough or deep enough. By the end of 2008, the company had drawn $19 billion in emergency government loans simply to keep operating. By June 2009, it needed the full bailout. The filing covered $82 billion in assets and $172 billion in liabilities. It was the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. It went through the court in 40 days. Even in collapse, they moved fast when they had no other choice. November 19, 2008. Rick Wagoner, CEO of General Motors, flew to Washington in a $36 million corporate Gulfstream to ask Congress for a $10 billion bailout. The round trip cost his cash-burning company $20,000. A first-class commercial ticket from Detroit would have cost $837. A congressman asked him directly whether it was appropriate to fly a private jet to beg for public money. Wagoner said the jet was used only for urgent situations. The exchange ran on every broadcast in the country that night. When Wagoner returned 2 weeks later, he drove. The government provided $49.5 billion to keep GM alive. Taxpayers lost approximately $10 billion on the deal. The US Treasury held 60.8% of the restructured company. Pontiac and Saturn were killed. Thousands of dealerships closed. Tens of thousands of workers lost jobs or pensions they had spent careers earning. What the jet image captured was not a single act of poor judgment. It was the entire story in one frame. A company that spent decades prioritizing executive comfort over customer value, financial optics over genuine performance, and institutional pride over honest self-assessment. The machine that once defined American ambition had become the perfect monument to what happens when dominance becomes a reason to stop improving. That is the permanent lesson of General Motors. Subscribe, share this, and I will see you in the next one.